I remember once watching a TV talk show where the guest celebrity talked about a cause that he was involved in. And another guest on the show said, you know, so many people are against things nowadays. It's nice to see someone who's for something. Now that may make a good soundbite and maybe be important if you're trying to come up with a catchy slogan for a political campaign. But being for something without being against its opposite is just a pile of rhetoric. When the Unitarian Universalist Association first presented the 8th principle about being anti-racist, a number of folks said, that sounds negative. Instead of being anti-racist, they said we should be for inclusion and for beloved community. The trouble with using only this positive formulation, though, is that you could say you're all for inclusion and beloved community without realizing it had anything to do with overcoming racism. In fact, you could be a white supremacist and still say you're for beloved community and inclusion and justice. In fact, many of them do. If you don't also spell out what you're against, then what you stand for may not be all that clear. A wise person once told me, you will be known not just by the friends you keep, but by the enemies you make. If no one is against you, what could you possibly stand for? That's why I'd like to talk today about what I call the positive power of negative thinking. That is, the importance of saying no sometimes. The importance of not doing, that is, refusing to cooperate with a system that doesn't match your values. You know, we sometimes hear the slogan, say yes to life, and that's all very good, but we forget there are times when maybe we need to say no. No, I won't accept this. We look at our lives and we tend to evaluate our worth on the basis of what we've done, when maybe it's at least as important to see what we haven't done, what we would not do, what we could not do. I could have lied, but I didn't. I could have hurt someone, but I refused. I was given a chance to cheat, but I said no. The Taoists have taught us this. In the Tao Te Ching, it is written, shape clay into a cup. It is the space within it, that is the nothingness in there, that makes it useful. Without this nothingness or empty space, this cup would merely be an interesting block of ceramic. It is the emptiness in here that makes it useful. The Tao Te Ching also says, cut doors for a room. It is the emptiness of the doorway that makes it possible to go in and out. Now, you might think the door itself is the important part, but the door just covers up the empty space when it's not in use. A door without a room to open into is just an interesting mark on a wall. It is the space, the nothingness, that is useful. Or someone said, a room without a door, a room with a door is a room without a door is a tomb. So I say, when you look at your life, don't just look at the things that you've said or done. Sometimes maybe the things you didn't say or didn't do are just as important. It's not just your deeds that will be recorded in the so-called book of life. It'll also be the things you didn't do, couldn't do. And it won't just be the words you said, but the words you could have said, but had the forbearance not to. For example, if you struggle with alcohol or another drug addiction, look at the times when you could have taken a drink or a pill, but you resisted the temptation. Those non-actions are sometimes your most important actions in the battle against addiction. If you are in a monogamous relationship, look at the opportunities you may have had to break that commitment, but didn't use. The fact that you could have taken a phony tax exemption, but wouldn't. Could have lied to the buyer when selling your car, but didn't. Could have cheated on your IRS forms, but wouldn't. Might have gotten your revenge on someone, but refused to. May have had the opportunity to be successful, the chance to really make it, only you'd have to step over someone else to do it. And you said, no, not at that cost. These are examples of what a beautiful word no can be, and what a meaningful action a non-act can be. And we definitely see this in religious history. A good deal of it was people saying no to the system around them. The Hebrew prophets saying no to the authorities who put ritual observance above caring for your neighbor. No, the Lord doesn't want your incense and fasting and bowing your head, spread sackcloth and ashes, said Isaiah. Isn't this the fast that I choose? To loosen the bonds of wickedness, to undo the thongs of the yoke, to let the oppressed go free. Isn't it to share your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless poor into your home, and when you see the naked to cover them and not hide yourself from your own flesh? Or Jesus being told that you can't heal on the Sabbath day because healing is work, which you can't do on the Sabbath. And Jesus said, no, the Sabbath was made for people, not people for the Sabbath. And you're all hypocrites anyway, because you know if one of your animals was in a ditch, you wouldn't wait until the Sabbath was over to get it out. You take it out right away. Aren't people as important as donkeys? And the Buddha saying no to the common preconceptions of religion at his time, saying, no, I'm not going to give you answers about theology or what happens after we die. It's not important to your journey to compassion. And as we heard in the opening words, no, I don't accept your gift of anger and abuse. It belongs to you. And forget about just religious history. Look at the civil rights movement. Tomorrow's Martin Luther King Day, so we're all probably thinking about that. And now imagine protesting segregation by just sitting in restaurants and doing nothing. Powerful, very powerful. And how do you think buses were desegregated? Again, by doing a nothing. That is, by not doing them. Both King and Gandhi showed the world how to effectively use boycotts. You see, staging a boycott is less of a doing, it's more of a not doing. It's not buying a particular product or not patronizing a particular business. And this not doing can do a lot. A strike works on the same premise. Want to upset the system? Don't cooperate with it. If you look at the history of the labor movement in the United States, you'll see whether not working works. Look at the history of boycotts to see whether you can purchase something important by not purchasing. A few of my personal favorites from history. In 1872, a woman named Susan B. Anthony was arrested for the crime of voting in a public education. She was found guilty and ordered to pay a $100 fine. She said no. But you must obey the law, they said, and she said no. The judge knew that if he held her in jail, she could appeal to a higher court, so he let her go. But Susan B. wouldn't stop there. After her trial, she went to Congress year after year to demand recognition of women's rights. You're not going to accomplish anything, they told her, so why don't you just give it up? And she said no. At age 86, this thin, emaciated woman gave her last speech and said in a soft, faltering voice, failure is impossible. At her death, only 14 states had granted women the right to vote. But did that stop the thousands of suffragists who followed in her footsteps? No. And their no passed the Anthony Amendment in 1920, granting women the legal right to say yes and no, and giving us a great code for getting in and out of certain buildings. About 70 years ago, on December 1st, 1955, a 42-year-old seamstress named Rosa Parks got on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama, and sat down in the first seat for blacks, right behind the white section. After a few stops, the bus began to fill in with white people, and the bus driver told her and 3 black men to stand up and give their seats to the whites. That was the law at that time. The black men did, but Rosa thought to herself, no, I don't need to stand the rest of the way home just so a white man can sit down. And this wasn't the first time Rosa Parks had done this. But this was the time when the civil rights movement decided to make a court case out of it. The bus driver yelled, "Hey, you, stand up for this white man." And Rosa said softly, "No." "Get up or I'll call the police," said the bus driver. And Rosa just sat there and with her whole body said, "No. No, I won't stand up. No, I won't go to the back of the bus. No, I will not be moved." And her resounding no began the Montgomery bus boycott under the leadership of the Reverend Martin Luther King Jr. African Americans said, "No, we won't ride the bus. We won't be second-class citizens anymore." And they forced Alabama and the bus company to integrate. Incidentally, they got even more than what they asked for at first. They first said, "It's okay, we don't mind sitting in the back, but if it gets crowded, we still want to be able to sit somewhere in the back and not have that taken away." Turned out that was all taken, no rules about that at all. And African Americans didn't stop there. They sat down at the lunch counter of an all-white diner, and they were told that only whites were allowed, so that would they leave, please? And they said no. They said, "Well, you have to leave or we'll bring the police." And they said no. And their no flew in the air even as they were forcibly removed. They and many others continued their no as they sang, "We shall overcome." Dr. King's no was heard even as he was shot to death. In 1968, the gay community in New York City was tired of being harassed and clubbed by the police. So one day, late in June, when the police came to attack them, they actually resisted arrest. "You must leave your gay bars," the police told them, and they said no. "You must stop congregating or we'll take you in," and the LGBTQ community said no. And that no was the beginning of Gay Pride Day, which has been celebrated every year since in cities across the country and even some across the world. Do you see? It is not just your yeses that make a difference in the world. It is also your no's and the things you couldn't do, the things you wouldn't do. Do you measure courage in terms of the actions you would be willing to take in the face of persecution or fear? Think not only of these, measure also by the actions you would not be willing to take in the face of temptation, the things you could not do, the things you would refuse to do. And if you would define the kind of person you are, look for more than the positive qualities. Are you a person who doesn't belittle people, doesn't condemn people, doesn't slander people? Are you a person who doesn't have to be right all the time? Who doesn't do something just because everyone else is doing it? Are you a person who doesn't cheat, doesn't steal, doesn't use or abuse or knowingly hurt others? If you are, then these non-vices may be as important as some of your virtues. Let me close with a story from a black man who grew up in New York in the 1950s. His name is Clifton Davis, and he had a life-altering experience during junior high during a trip to Washington, D.C. And let me apologize in advance for a water balloon prank that he and his friends played on unsuspecting people. I've probably done that myself in the past. But anyway, the larger point he makes is the important part of the story. All right. In 1959, this is Clifton Davis speaking. In 1959, I was 13 years old, a poor black kid living with my mother and stepfather in a small black ghetto on Long Island, New York. My mother worked nights in a hospital, and my stepfather drove a coal truck. Needless to say, our standard of living was somewhat short of the American dream. Nevertheless, when my 8th grade teacher announced a graduation trip to Washington, D.C., it never crossed my mind that I would be left behind. Besides a complete tour of the nation's capital, we would visit Glen Echo Amusement Park in Maryland. And in my imagination, Glen Echo was Disneyland, Knott's Berry Farm, and Magic Mountain rolled into one. But when my mother saw how much the trip cost, she just shook her head. We couldn't afford it. After feeling sad for 10 seconds, I decided to try to fund the trip myself. For the next 8 weeks, I sold candy bars door to door, delivered newspapers, and mowed lawns. 3 days before the deadline, I had made just barely enough. I was going. The day of the trip, trembling with excitement, I climbed onto the train. I was the only non-white in our section. Our hotel was not far from the White House. My roommate was Frank. Leaning together out of our window and dropping water balloons on tourists quickly cemented our new friendship. Every morning, almost 100 of us loaded noisily onto our bus for another adventure. We visited the Lincoln Memorial twice, once in daylight and once at dusk. But one morning, a chaperone said, "Clifton, could I see you for a moment?" The other guys at my table, especially Frank, turned pale. We had been joking about the previous night's direct water balloon hit on a lady and her poodle. It was a stupid, dangerous act, but luckily nobody got hurt. We were celebrating our escape from punishment when the chaperone asked to see me. "Clifton," she began, "do you know about the Mason-Dixon line?" "No," I said, wondering what this had to do with drenching a lady and her dog. "Before the Civil War," she explained, "the Mason-Dixon line was originally the boundary between Maryland and Pennsylvania, the dividing line between the slave states and the free states." I noticed that her eyes were damp and her hands were shaking. "Today," she continued, "the Mason-Dixon line is a kind of invisible border between the North and the South. When you cross that invisible line out of Washington, D.C. into Maryland, things change." Glen Echo Amusement Park is in Maryland, and the management there doesn't allow Negroes inside. She stared at me in silence. "You mean I can't go to the park I studied because I'm a Negro?" She nodded slowly. "I'm sorry, Clinton," she said, taking my hand. "You'll have to stay in the hotel tonight. Why don't you and I watch a movie on television?" I walked to the elevators, feeling confusion, disbelief, anger, and a deep sadness. "What happened, Clifton?" Frank said when I got back to the room. "Did the lady with the dog tell on us?" Without saying a word, I just walked over to my bed, lay down, and cried. Frank was stunned into silence. Junior high boys didn't cry, at least not in front of each other. It wasn't just missing the class adventure that made me feel so sad. For the first time in my life, I learned what it felt like to be a real N-word, he would say. Of course, there was discrimination in the North, but the color of my skin had never officially kept me out of a coffee shop, a church, or an amusement park. "Clifton," Frank whispered, "what is the matter?" "They won't let me go to Glen Echo Park tonight," I sobbed. "Because of the water balloon?" "No," I answered, "because I'm a Negro." "Well, that's a relief," Frank said, and then he laughed. Obviously relieved to have escaped punishment for our caper with the balloons. "I thought it was serious," he said. And wiping away the tears with my sleeve, I stared at him. "It is serious. They don't let Negroes into the park. I can't go with you. That's pretty damn serious to me." And then Frank said, "Then I won't go either." For an instant, we just froze. And then Frank grinned, and I'll never forget the moment. Frank was just a kid. He wanted to go to that amusement park as much as I did. But there was something even more important than the class night out. The next thing I knew, the room was filled with kids listening to Frank. "They don't allow Negroes in the park," he said, "so I'm staying with Clifton." "Me too," a second boy said. "Those jerks," a third muttered. "I'm with you, Clifton." My heart raced. Suddenly I was not alone. A pint-sized revolution had been born. The Water Balloon Brigade, 11 white boys from Long Island, had made its decision. We won't go. And as I sat on my bed in the center of it all, I felt grateful. But above all, I was filled with pride. Later, as we sat in the hotel, a chaperone came in waving an envelope. "Boys," he shouted, "I've just bought 13 tickets to the Senators-Tigers game. Anybody want to go?" The room erupted in cheers. Not one of us had ever been to a professional baseball game in a real baseball park. On the way to the stadium, we grew silent as our driver passed before the Lincoln Memorial. For one long moment, I stared through the marble pillars at Mr. Lincoln, bathed in that warm yellow light. There was still no smile and no sign of hope in his sad and tired eyes. We here highly resolve that this nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. Whenever I hear those words from Lincoln's speech at Gettysburg, I remember my 11 white friends, and I feel hope once again. The power of no and the power of hope. I think we have a little time if anyone would like to make a comment or